A little history about the diagnosis. For those of you who have been in education for a while, you might remember the term minimal brain dysfunction, or MBD, and it was a diagnostic term that was like an umbrella label for a number of neurological conditions which today are separated out from each other. For example, learning disabilities, coordination problems, attention deficit disorder. And then when mental health practitioners got together and created DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4th edition, they created the term or the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity. And then over the last few years, there's been some debate about whether the condition exists without hyperactivity. And we agree now that you can have attention deficits without hyperactivity, which, as we'll talk about a little later with regards to females with this condition, was a very important acknowledgement, since so many females with this condition were being missed when we insist on having hyperactivity as part of the criteria. So that's a little history. I always hear concerns in the media about whether we're overdiagnosing attention deficit disorder, and if so, is it just to feed the coffers of the pharmaceutical companies who are making Ritalin and Dexedrine? And not being a psychiatrist, not prescribing the medication myself, I think I have a relatively objective view on it. And I think there have been some important changes in family structure and society, and also your knowledge base as teachers, that have made the biggest difference in terms of the increase of the diagnosis. In terms of changes in family form and society, I notice that in terms of how much children respect the authority of adults, I think it's changed dramatically in the last 20 years. So in the past, where first graders would worry the day before school started in September or August, hoping that their first grade teacher would be nice, now what we have are first grade teachers praying that their students are going to be nice. I know from playing Little League as a child, it was an honor to go and run and get the equipment bag from the coach when he arrived and help clean up afterwards. Now, having been a Little League coach in the last few years, you're lucky to get any help at all before, after the game, during the practice, or any other time. So clearly, to me, there's been a significant change in how children view adults, and rather than have a healthy or fearful respect for adults, what we've developed, and I'll talk about why I think this has happened, children who really are expert manipulators and managements of environments. And I don't use the term manipulation in a bad way, and I think we do that too much with children. After all, children have to learn how to be adults, which means they have to learn how to manipulate their environment, so we often use that term against them. But I think as an advocate for families bringing up their own children, and not a big advocate of daycare when it's not absolutely necessary, that more and more as children are brought up by institutional daycare centers, in other words, from 6, 12, 18 months until kindergarten, they're in environments with 10 or 15 or more children and 1 or 2 adults. What we do are train children how to manage and manipulate environments, how to manage and manipulate adults, rather than respect them. By the time they get to kindergarten or first grade, they know just how to find your buttons to push. They know just how to push them. They know how to find the weak spots in organizations. And what we have now are more and more teachers and parents and coaches and anybody who is running groups and organizations with children negotiating and compromising to get their respect or to get their compliance, rather than just telling them what they're going to do and have the children do it because you're an adult telling them what to do. So certainly when I went to school, happy and sad faces were not necessary, point systems were not necessary. You never ever brought your classwork home. The only thing you did at home was homework, because there weren't questions about these things. There wasn't a question about whether you were going to finish your work, whether you're going to listen to the teacher, and you didn't need to be rewarded all day to do so. How does this relate to ADD and the increase in the diagnosis? Because I think that the attention deficit syndrome comes in different severities, and the children who are in the middle range, 15 to 20 years ago and more, would be held together in the tight structure of an authority-based classroom. But in classrooms where there's a lot of negotiating and paying off and bribing in order to get the children to behave, these children are too loose and start to show symptoms in a classroom structure like that. I'm not blaming you for this, and I'm not saying that you're doing anything wrong. I think it's a function of just some basic changes in families, not schools. In other words, you have responded to what is change in family form rather than the schools being the cause of the change themselves. So we're seeing children who are in looser environments become looser, and in tighter environments they probably wouldn't be this symptomatic. We're seeing an increase in those children showing the hyperactivity or the impulsivity symptoms. And the other thing is that when you have children who are severely impulsive or hyperactive, rather than relegating them to the bad classroom or ESC, you're identifying these children as possibly having impulsivity problems because of attention deficit syndrome and referring them for help. They get counseling, education, maybe medication, and the children stabilize and do much better. So I think those are two reasons why we're seeing more of it. Not that there are more children with the condition than there were 10 or 20 years ago, and not that there is some plan to identify more children just to give out more drugs. One of the important things that you need to know about the attention deficit syndrome is that it is not environmentally caused. There is nothing that parents can do through parenting that can create this condition. So if a child is wild and loose because there's no structure at home, that cannot be attention deficit syndrome. That's some other kind of problem. Yeah. But when you're talking about attention deficit syndrome specifically and formally, we're talking about a condition that's inherited in most cases, passed down in families. So whenever you have a child in your classroom who clearly has this trait, likely one or both parents were like this too when they were children. The other thing that can create attention deficit-like symptoms is exposure to drugs and alcohol in the first trimester of pregnancy, or oxygen problems during the birth process. And that's not just attention deficit syndrome, but those developmental problems usually lead to learning disabilities, coordination problems, all of the things that we used to call minimal brain dysfunction, because they are brain-related difficulties. So it's first and foremost a neurological problem, and one that seems to be inherited. I like to stay away from seeing it as a disorder or a disease. Unfortunately, when psychology and mental health in general was accepted in this country, it was first accepted by the medical community. So diagnoses carry disease terminology, just like you were talking about diabetes or cancer. So we talk about children or adults having attention deficit syndrome or attention deficit disorder. Meanwhile, we cannot find this thing on any test. We can't do CAT scans, brain scans, or psychological tests to find this thing that we call attention deficit disorder. So rather than say that a child has this, I think it's more accurate to talk about it as a trait. In other words, a child or adult is like this. And also it helps children get away from this sense of being damaged or diseased. Well, you've got ADD, or she's got ADD, which makes it sound like they've got something kind of percolating in their body that's going to turn into something horrible or some disease entity. So the reality is that we don't know about this thing. We can't find it anywhere. We just see it as a cluster of symptoms. And it seems to be a trait. And the most important thing that I'm going to tell you today is that the diagnostic term attention deficit disorder is very inaccurate in leading you to what the most important symptoms are of this condition. So I talk about it as a condition, and attention span and hyperactivity are very unimportant in looking at what this really is, and it would be much better named chronic boredom syndrome than attention deficit syndrome. So what we see on the outside, which are children who have trouble paying attention, we use the term distractibility. We see children who are hyperactive and seem to be overstimulated, really betrays the reality that children and adults who have attention deficit syndrome or who are like it are in fact understimulated creatures. It is not a neurologically overstimulated situation. All of the overactivity and impulsivity is the brain's attempt to fend off boredom. So the issue is not that we need to reduce boredom in their environments in order to get them to pay attention. In fact, you have to increase stimulation. Do the opposite of what we were led to think about, especially in the school settings when screens were used. We thought that if we pulled stimuli off the boards and we put screens around children who had ADD, that we'd increase the amount of work and focus on the task, when in fact what it does is increase boredom and reduce the likelihood that the children will focus on the task. The only benefit is that the children around that child with ADD may not be as distracted as much when the screen's around them. So what I'm telling you is that this is not a problem of attention span. And one of the other negatives about seeing it as a problem of attention span is that the reality is that every one of these children and adults can pay attention just fine whenever they're doing things that stimulate them. The terminology that parents and teachers and other people use is that you only do things that you like to do, or you only do the things that you want to do, or you only do things when it's convenient for you. And all of those statements miss the point that the children only do things that are very stimulating to them. And why is that important? Because it gets past this idea that children have a choice over whether they're going to do things or not when they have attention deficit syndrome. What is puzzling is that if you have a child who enjoys science, and for 45 minutes during a science lesson, they do not turn their heads, they do not talk, they don't ask to go to the bathroom, they don't ask to sharpen a pencil. You have their complete attention, they memorize everything you say, and then you shift to social studies. And for 30 seconds, you can't hold their attention. It appears that they're doing this on purpose. But in fact, what's going on is that during science class, they were neurologically stimulated enough, and during social studies class, they're not stimulated at all. What I'm telling you is that there is no gray area of being stimulated for children or adults who have this condition. There are no 5s on a scale from 1 to 10. They are either completely interested or completely bored. And that's why you see such a rapid drop-off in attention span as soon as they stop doing what they want to do. And really what's happening is that they stop doing what's stimulating to them. So it's better to see the children as being like television sets without antennas, that all of the signals are right around them just like they are around every other child, but because they don't have good receivers, only the strongest, most powerful, most stimulating signals are received and picked up and processed. So why do they seem not to memorize things or remember things that you tell them? It's not that they have memory problems or comprehension problems. It's that they never even get to the first stage of processing the information, which is to pick up the signal. It seems to be an attention problem, but really the problem is not attention span, because if they like the Rugrats, they can watch a Rugrat marathon for 5 hours with all heck breaking loose around them in the house. If they enjoy Lego blocks, they can do that for 2 or 3 hours and construct elaborate cities and states using that. So what the pediatricians have done in the past, if the child sits on the table and for 35 minutes listens to the conversation and they're not up and down off the examining table and they're not in and out of the room, the pediatrician says, well, this can't be ADD because children with ADD can't sit like this for 30 minutes. Well, if hypodermic needles are interesting to that child, and stethoscopes are interesting to that child, and the smell of alcohol is stimulating to that child, they will have no trouble doing that for quite an extended period of time. So rather than paying attention for extended periods of time, ruling out ADD, it in fact is what attention deficit disorder is. It's the capacity to pay attention only under highly stimulating conditions. So that your children in your classes shift capacity to pay attention depending on what they're doing is not their choice consciously. It's how their brains are responding. Remember, what's a 10 to you may be a 0 to them. So you cannot judge stimulation based on what's interesting to you. You can only do that based on what's interesting to the child. And in fact, you can pretty much categorize all of their 8s, 9s, and 10s, because in conditions where children have ADD, those are the only things that they will attend to. Those are the only subject areas, the only magazines, the only books, because for them, as I said before, there is no middle ground of interest. So it is first and foremost a problem of chronic boredom. In other words, these are children whose outward behaviors are all the brain's attempts to fend off and counteract boredom, and the other primary symptoms are these: a difficulty in regulating emotions, so that children with this condition tend to exaggerate feeling experiences. They make big things out of little. Everything's unjust, everything's unfair, nobody likes me, everybody hates me. And sometimes some scary things for teachers and parents. Children will often talk about killing themselves, because not only aren't there gray areas of stimulation and interest, but there isn't much gray emotionally either. They're either very, very happy or very, very sad, or very, very angry or not angry at all. In other words, that gauge goes from 0 to 10 in almost everything they do when the condition is from the middle to the severe range. So as a psychologist, it won't be unusual to have a child not on medication who's very impulsive and give them psychological tests, for example, like the Rorschach test, which is an ink blot test, or a test where you have a child tell stories to pictures, and get stories that are full of blood, gore, sex, and violence at 9, 10, or 11 years old. Your first impression is that this is a very disturbed child. They have no censorship. They have no controls. But what happens is that those themes and subject areas are 9s and 10s for all of us. And when they're looking at these pictures, whether they're Rorschach cards or pictures that they have to tell a story to, they think about seeing a cat with its head chopped off and then the rest of it was run over by a car and blood's gushing out. Well, other children might see that, but because they know they're in the shrink's office, they're not going to tell you that. But the child with ADD is going to tell you exactly what they see, because they don't have much censorship on what they're seeing. And it's not that they're more disturbed psychologically than the other children. It's that they're not only impulsive behaviorally, but they're impulsive emotionally. They overreact and over-respond, giving us the indication that they're more disturbed than they really are. So I'm not saying to not worry about suicide threats, or I'm going to kill him, or I'm going to kill her, but put in the context, if we're talking about an impulsive child, and think, when the child has been like this before, in a matter of minutes can they turn around and seem to be the happiest child in class? In other words, you want to evaluate how deep the emotions run, because with the ADD situation, they oftentimes don't run very deep, and they shift back and forth just like attention span and behaviors do. The other thing that children have trouble regulating, those children who have this condition, is sensory experience. So it's not unusual to find children who hold their ears to sounds that are not loud to other people, who have over-responsive taste buds, so that they like food either very bland, or children with under-responsive taste buds and like everything spiced up. Or children who are very sensitive to touch and will only wear shorts even when it's 25 degrees out, or who hate spandex or any belt around their waist. Tags have to come out of the clothing. And interestingly, I hear over and over again, The ridge on the top of the sock in the front has to be directly over the toes, because if any part of it comes underneath, the shoe comes off, and they will spend another 5 or 10 minutes adjusting it so they don't feel that difference underneath their little or big toe. Now, I'm not saying that every child who is like this has ADD, but I see these things come up more frequently in children who have this condition, telling us that along with the boredom difficulty, that there's a regulation difficulty or a filtering difficulty of external stimuli coming in. Any questions or comments about these core issues? Because what I'm telling you is never to worry about attention span ever again when talking about this condition. Never diagnose it, never judge it based on attention span as your primary indicator. So if you're in class or you're at home or in somebody else's home and you want to do a quick diagnosis to see if you're on the right track, if you think a child might have attention deficit disorder, especially with hyperactivity, then a good thing to do is to allow the child to get into a situation where they're very loose and very impulsive, and take a toy or an activity that they enjoy or that they're stimulated by and introduce it to the situation. And if it is attention deficit syndrome, you're likely to eliminate all of the problem behaviors and emotions while the child is stimulated. When the problems are emotional, and we'll talk a little bit about this, depression and anxiety, which can mimic ADD, it is not as easy to magically get rid of these problem behaviors just by stimulating the child. It's generally a lifelong condition. So the idea that ADD disappears when children hit puberty is false. The idea that children don't need medication when they hit puberty is false. That somehow it won't work anymore is false. In fact, because the work demands increase in high school, children who have the more severe cases need their medication even more from middle school on than they do in elementary school. It looks a little bit different in adulthood. We have adults who hop from college to college, from career to career, from major to major, from relationship to relationship, from speeding ticket to speeding ticket, car accidents to car accidents, because life is not stimulating enough to them, so they keep searching. Rather than hyperactivity, as you might see it in your classroom, they're hyperactive in other ways by jumping around from thing to thing in their lives. The only thing that seems to disappear a little bit is kind of the classic hyperactivity, so it's not that unusual to see a very hyperactive little boy turn into a major couch potato as a teenager. But the difficulties with organizing things, with completing assignments, with keeping up with schoolwork, should not be much different than when they were younger. So it's typically a trait that follows them throughout their childhood and adulthood. What's important about this, especially for anybody who's helping a child through high school, is that these are children who, when they turn into adults, will have a very hard time doing for a living what is not a passion for them. So if you're a teacher at the elementary school level of a very impulsive child, it's good to help the parents identify the things in school that they love to do, that they could do for hours on end, because while they may not have a choice in childhood during the school day to do everything they want to do, certainly as adults they'll have a lot more choice to do during the day what they want. And it's very important between 14 years old and 18 for parents and teachers and guidance counselors to focus in not on what the child is struggling with, but what the child loves to do to make sure that the college they go to and the career they get into reflect these 9s and 10s on their stimulus scale, rather than what we might think is a good career to get into, which for that child with ADD might be very boring and never be a success at and never complete the requirements for. The diagnostic process is fairly easy but not very specific in that, as I said before, there are no tests for this condition. So the best way to diagnose it is through a developmental interview. In other words, you want to go back in time as far as you can go with parents to find symptoms of attention deficit syndrome. In other words, since this is a neurological condition generally and it's inherited, you don't find it starting in 4th grade. If a child in K through 3 has no comments on report cards about staying on task, about working up to potential, about completing work in school, about behaving well, and all of these things have been areas without any problem, and all of a sudden in the middle of 4th grade, they can't finish their schoolwork, they can't keep to themselves. This is very likely an emotional, environmental kind of an issue rather than an issue of attention deficit syndrome. So in most cases, except in those very mild conditions, you can go back to infancy and find symptoms of this condition. And the further back you can go and find problems, the more likely it is inherited and neurological, the more likely it's genetically passed on, and the more likely it's going to kind of follow them through as a trait. It's just kind of a principle to go by. So when people ask to be evaluated, it's really not, it's not accurate to say I'd like my child tested or I'd like you to test this child in my class, because there are no tests for ADD. The closest that we come are the child behavior checklists that I know you all use, whether it's the Devereaux or the Connors. I guess the schools are using more than anything now. And the most important thing with the checklist is to know that you always have to keep in mind you're comparing a particular child to other children same age and same sex. Some of the checklists have this built in and some don't. DSM-4 criteria, this is this manual I was talking about, is this book with about 15 different criteria. You can have attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity or without hyperactivity, and the hyperactivity symptoms really revolve around lots of impulsivity, not to be able to keep the body under control. Always should evaluate for learning disabilities. Why? Because a greater percentage, maybe 25 to 30% of children who are accurately diagnosed with attention deficit syndrome have accompanying learning disabilities. So whenever you think there's a problem with the chronic boredom syndrome, I think it's always good to do a individualized achievement test like the Woodcock-Johnson, just to screen for deficits in math or reading or written expression or spelling, because you're more frequently going to get them with this population of children. Sleeping patterns and sensory experience, because when you put your head down on the pillow and shut the light out, stimulation is basically at its lowest point, hopefully, for you during the day. If we talk about children whose brains can't tolerate boredom, it's not a wonder why most children with this condition have sleep disturbance. And now it makes sense if you think about it, why children who have this condition tend to put themselves to sleep by doing things that look crazy to us, like banging their crib up against the wall over and over again, by banging their head up against the wall over and over again, by insisting that you load your dryer up with sneakers and turn it on and put the car seat on top of the dryer to pound them to sleep. Because you have to, at 2 in the morning, get up, put them in the car, and drive around Ormond Beach for an hour to put them to sleep. Well, if we're talking about these children as being neurologically understimulated, it makes sense that stimulating their brains creates a level of homeostasis or equilibrium that allows them to wander off and go to sleep. And it's also why for some of the children, being on medication at night, the stimulants, actually help them go to sleep, where for people without ADD, they may overstimulate you and keep you up. I talked about emotional responsiveness, social skills. Unfortunately, because stimulation is the name of the game for many of the children who have this condition, they tend to be very bossy and controlling. Why? Because as soon as they stop bossing kids around and let go of control, they're not doing what they want to do anymore. So the typical social pattern is for children with this condition to play with children younger or older, because the older ones give them their way and the younger ones they can boss around. Same age peers expect reciprocity. If I play your game for 10 minutes, I expect you're going to play my game for 10 minutes. Well, the child with ADD can play their game for 10 minutes, but when it comes to exchanging, it's very hard for them to tolerate and wait for the turn to come back to them. So unless you have a very popular, charming child with ADD who kids want to hang around anyway, even though they're always doing what the child with ADD wants to do, usually the children with ADD end up being kind of isolated or separated from their same age peers, and especially at home and in the community, they're gravitating towards the older kids and the younger kids because it means they'll be able to do more of what they want to do. They are not conscious of this. They don't know that they're doing this. They're not doing this on purpose. They're being driven to do this. They're being driven to stimulate themselves up to 24 hours a day to fend off the uncomfortable boredom. Bonding and attachment. For the very severely affected children in terms of impulsivity and hyperactivity, many of them have a difficult time between 0 and 2 years old sitting in their parents' lap and accepting love and affection. Why? Because it's too boring to sit there for any length of time. Their brains tell them to arch their back, get up and get down, and start walking and moving around. So what happens is that we can have children, if they're not caught early enough, who basically treat the world, and I mean the world of people, as things and objects. And while this is not that unusual in the first year of life, you expect by age 3 that children are distinguishing people from things, and the relationships they have with people have a different quality than the relationships that they have with things. But children who never sit long enough to be loved and hugged and to accept affection just go from one stimulus to another. They'll trade in a parent for a stranger if the stranger has candy or money or something stimulating. And by 6 or 7, what I hear from parents is that I know this child has lived with me for 6 years. I've got other children in the home. This child feels like they've been a boarder there for 6 years. I feed them, they sleep there, but they would trade me in a second for somebody else who had a better deal. Now, this is not typical, but it is more likely to happen as kind of a consequence of this condition when it's severe and the impulsivity and the hyperactivity is very early onset. Rule out depression and anxiety. As I mentioned before, the primary condition that can look like ADD is depression and anxiety. And why? Because anxiety almost always goes along with depression in people in general, but with children even more often, because depression is a very uncomfortable condition. I see it almost like a death equivalent for kids. So like a dog on its last days of its life won't stop pacing because it's scared that if it lies down it won't get up again. I think when children start to feel the drag emotionally of depression, rather than become lethargic and tired and sleepy like adults typically do, they activate against depression and become hyperactive. So we always need to look at when did this behavior start. The later it starts, the less likely it is neurological or attention deficit disorder. And of course, the other thing that you want to look for is an environmental trigger. In other words, did this happen when something changed in the child's family? And that's one of the ways that we look to separate attention deficit disorder from depression and anxiety. Any concerns or questions about that issue of depression? Now, it doesn't take long for children to be depressed and to develop low self-esteem. If you have a child that is severely impulsive and hyperactive, chances are if they've had to go to daycare, that they have sampled every daycare center in their community, because there are a few daycare centers that can put up with that for very long. Being thrown out of one daycare center after another and constantly hearing from adults, get back, sit down, how many times do I have to tell you, back in the corner, back for a timeout. 3 or 4 years of this, by the time you see them in kindergarten or first grade, they have self-esteems that are horrible. So we can see and typically do depressions that sit on top of the attention deficit disorder, and you then have two problems at the same time. It would be hard for children not to be depressed if this condition includes the impulsivity and behavior problems that typically go along with it. For those who don't have the impulsivity, report cards can end up doing that to them by 4th or 5th grade, because you have otherwise bright and effective children who are learning everything they need to learn, but they're not doing everything they need to do, and the report cards reflect productivity rather than learning, and they end up using the report cards as a gauge for their intelligence rather than their productivity level, and their self-esteems go down because they don't feel like good students, and their parents are coming down on them a lot at home. Talk a little bit more about this. So really thyroid problems can sometimes mimic ADHD. Sugar and dyes have never been proven in any research study to have anything to do with ADD or, to tell you the truth, any other behavior pattern in children. It's important to know this because sometimes chocolate chip cookies can be very important reinforcers for a child at night to do more homework, to clean their room. And it bothers many parents, but bribing and negotiating is an important part of surviving life with a child with ADD at home, because I'm talking to you about children who need excessive amounts of stimuli, and just your word to clean a room or to take a bath or to brush their teeth is not enough to get the motivation centers in their brain activated chemically in order to trigger the response to your word. So we need to constantly pick up the level of stimulation to get children to move on things at home or at school. In early childhood, just some things to look for. Difficulty in pleasing them. Again, stimulus thresholds are too high. It takes too much to reach them. So things that would normally be stimulating, like reading a story sitting in your lap, is not stimulating enough. Even television programs that would normally stimulate most children are not active enough. They're going right to the MTV or those types of programs where the images are fast, furious, and powerful. Unable to occupy their own time, so by 3, 4, or 5, where we expect children to play on their own for a while, children who constantly need to be entertained. Come play with me, come play with me, do this with me, do that with me, because playing on their own is not enough to reach their stimulus threshold. Early gross motor milestones. This would be a very interesting research study for somebody interested in child development and attention deficit disorder. I have seen an incredible number of children with this condition who parents tell me were walking at 6 and 7 months old. Now, for those of you who have children who have walked at 11, 12, or 13 months old, go back and remember what your child was like at 6 or 7 months old and try to imagine up on their feet and walking around the house. It's very hard to do. But because these children are practicing the gross motor skills so early as a way of fending off boredom, those skills are developed way too soon, and they're doing things in terms of gross motor development before their time. Too often we mistake this for intelligence. The fact of the matter is that there is no difference in intelligence levels with children who have attention deficit disorder than any other child. But when you have children who are bound to certain stimuli, they get over-practiced or over-knowledgeable about certain subject areas because that's what they're doing 90% of the time. And if you touch that skill or that knowledge area with them, you'll see they're way ahead of where you'd expect them to be and think, boy, this is really a bright child. And it may not be that they're any more intelligent than the average child, but just that they're overdoing it in that particular subject area or that particular physical gross motor skill. Sleep disturbance I discussed, disorganized play. I'm sure you see that in your classrooms. Daycare hopping I mentioned. Failure to develop attachments to objects. Before I talked about not being able to sit in parents' laps, I'm also talking about children who don't have special blankets, who don't have special dolls, who don't have special pacifiers, who are very easy to trade in anything that they have for something else. Why? Because the principle of novel stimuli is that anything new will carry a higher stimulus value than something that's been going on for a while. In school age, poor social skills I mentioned, being accident prone. Because children who have this condition tend to act before they think, constantly searching for stimulus, more stitches, more broken bones, more Band-Aids, more falls. The impulsivity physically creates this problem. Increasingly poor school performance. When you have children who do not have learning disabilities, and I mean neurologically based learning disabilities like dyslexia or math problems or written expression, what you have with the ADD situation are performance and productivity problems. And this is your biggest challenge as teachers. If the behavior is under control with behavior plan or medication, is how do you deal with children who are underproductive? How do you grade them? How do you modify their assignments? Because really, one of the principles in life for children with ADD is how do I get done with what I don't want to do as quickly as possible? Well, in giving workout, you probably have a number of children who, after doing 2 math problems, master the task. And then you have children who need 15 to practice and master the task. Well, if you require everybody to do 15, most of the children are willing to do it, even those who after 3 know exactly what they're doing. But these children with this condition don't want to do it as soon as it gets boring to them, and that happens almost immediately. So what happens is that they either will just throw down answers, or a situation where the teacher says, in 20 minutes I'm going to collect the paper, finish all of your math problems. They rush through the first 3 in about 7 seconds, and then say, now I see how quickly I can do this. I'll just wait till the last 2 minutes. In the meantime, I'll doodle, I'll talk, I'll go to the bathroom, and then I'll rush to get the rest of it done. Well, of course, they don't keep track of this. So the teacher is then collecting the papers. They rush and do 3 more. They get 5 correct and 15 wrong. Well, they really get 100 in terms of their knowledge and their mastery, but they get an F on the paper because they didn't finish. And the report cards are going to reflect, as they go from 3rd grade to 4th grade to 5th grade to 6th grade, not a decreasing amount of effort, but that the effort that got them A's and B's in 2nd grade no longer is enough to do all of the busy work to get them A's and B's in 5th grade. The parents see this gradual deterioration in grades. They panic because they think their children are not learning as much. Those CTBS scores come in and they look the same in 5th grade as they do in 2nd grade. They're still solidly average. So one of the problems is that for children, their struggle is not to learn, but to produce. And ADD in the context of school or work environments is a problem of productivity. And unfortunately, because you have to teach in your classrooms to such a wide range of abilities, it ends up being, grades end up being to some degree, a productivity issue, unless you're able to grade children just on what they know rather than what they do. But that's not easy in many classroom situations. Hopefully you'll flex your system with homework. We'll talk about that in a little while. Variable handwriting and slow on written tasks. I'll put these together. penmanship for children with attention deficit syndrome is often a real horrible kind of thing. One day they're outside the lines by an inch. The next day they're writing like this. You can hardly read it. There are attempts to compensate for the impulsivity. Some days it looks perfect, leading you to believe that when it's not, they have control over it. And really what's happening is just their brain is functioning from day to day at different levels. Their capacity to regulate themselves changes from day to day. And what I see in giving many IQ tests, those of you who are familiar with the Wechsler scale, there's a test called coding, and it's kind of a clerical speed test. The children have to put little designs under numbers, and they have 2 minutes to do as many of these as they can. It almost invariably is one of the lowest scores, along with the auditory memory scores on the IQ. So it seems not only to be a sloppiness issue, but they also often have a hard time moving that pen or pencil across the page with the same speed that other children do, making it harder for them to complete assignments in the same period of time. This is why you will see probably in many 504 plans for children with attention deficit syndrome the opportunity to have more time to finish written assignments. And what I think is possibly another solution, to allow the children to do their work on computers. After all, this generation of children will probably not be using writing instruments at all in college, and maybe not in high school. In fact, they'll all be typing, if not dictating, onto a disk, which then will transcribe everything into text. So when you prioritize for children who have ADD and they're struggling in school so much, make sure that you kind of work with them in looking at their lives, seeing the grand scheme of things rather than the little details, which for them as adults may not be so important, so that if writing speed is a real struggle for them and it's turning them off completely to written expression, but when they get on that keyboard, they have no trouble at all typing as quickly as anybody else. Be flexible enough to tell them, don't ever use this pencil again. Use the keyboard, the computer's in the back. Every time you do your homework at home, use your computer, because you know when you grow up, there won't be any such thing as pencils or pens, and that will be the truth. I know it's hard for elementary school teachers to give up the idea of handwriting. I know many of you think it's an important skill. And I'm not saying do it with everybody, but when you can let go of it because it's a deficit area for a child, and in reality it's probably not going to make a difference in their adulthood, it's hard for them to look forward and realize that. Because what's important to you is important to them, even though 20 years down the road it may not be important in their lives. What? What's wild?
To think that all that we're doing.
Not all that you're doing,
I'm talking about things that we're working on. Like
some of the things. But can you see that? Can you see it coming?
Oh,
yeah.
I hope it comes quickly.
I was saying to Pat, I was reading some newspaper and saw an advertisement for a handheld dictating machine, which comes with a compact disc that interfaces with a computer program to turn what you dictate into text. Well, we're seeing this right now. Can you imagine 15 years from now, or 10 years from now, when this group is in college, how they're going to be writing papers? I was talking about keyboards last year. They won't even be using keyboards. So we can see that, and just, you know, for those children who need this extra assistance and can use this technology now so that they don't build their self-esteem around what they don't do well, then take advantage of the opportunity to introduce them to some of this technology so they can forget about the fact that they have some deficits and in their adulthood won't mean a thing. Expert procrastinators. Well, the thing with procrastination, we all do it to some extent, but it is almost a form of religion in people who have attention deficit disorder. And this is how it goes, that if you have an assignment that's due on Friday and it's Wednesday night, what happens is that by 5th or 6th grade, they know just how long it takes them to do everything. So if you have a 2-page paper, they know they can blaze that off in Oh, maybe an hour and a half. Well, until it's an hour and a half before the paper's due, it does not have to be done. And they can think of a zillion other things that they'd rather do, because the paper may be a 2 on Wednesday. On Thursday, it's a 4. And I'm telling you that it doesn't matter what it is unless it's an 8. Thursday night, it's a 5. Friday morning, it's a 7. And then an hour and a half before it's due, it's an 8. And they're skipping a class, or while they're in science, they're doing their social studies paper. So what happens is that they use deadlines as a form of stimulation. They use the deadline to stimulate their brains so that the motivation center clicks in and gets them to move. This is not a conscious choice. This is all a neurological happening and condition. By the time they're in high school and college, they have this all down, if they've survived academically, to a science. And sleepless nights, all-nighters are just the way it's done. And hopefully until that all-nighter, they're at least having fun and they're not anxious. And most of them are not, because they know that the day of the show, it will be done. Now, the problem is that on the papers, what they see is A for content, C for quality of organization or for quality of work. If only you would have started this 3 days ago, this would have been a great paper. But they're so used to this that really just getting it done in passing is survival for them. And that's how they get through. We'll seem to have reading comprehension problems, but really don't. Oftentimes, children with this condition get accused of having poor memories and reading comprehension problems. Well, what's happening with the memory is, as I said before, they're not even getting to the point of paying attention to what they're reading or what they're listening to. But there's not a song on the radio that they like that they can't memorize in 1 or 2 listens. They can remember dialogue from movies without any problems. Whenever you have children who are like that, but they can't memorize anything you say in science class, it is not a memory problem. It's not selective listening. It's that they are not being stimulated enough by mid to low level stimuli to ever even begin to put it into memory banks. Part of what we're dealing with is that the stimuli that you're competing with now is not lost in space on TV every afternoon, but it's incredible computer games and computer activities and violent and sexually oriented music videos that it's very hard for any adult to compete with in any setting. So that's part of it. It's not that it's created ADD, but it certainly has set a standard for stimulation that's much too high. And how can we ever expect to turn children on to books when they want that stimulation fast and furious and immediate? They don't want character development. I can even notice a change in movies and have a hard time finding any that are decent, because none of them spend any time developing characters anymore. It's just the superficial violence or sex or activity rather than relationship development and plot and concepts. All of that is gone. And the children growing up now are being brought up on this and have a whole new standard of what is stimulating and interesting and exciting to them. And that's just an incredible challenge to all of you. In terms of reading, the same thing. Rarely do children have reading problems who have good reading mechanics. More likely with attention deficit syndrome, it's that they're not paying attention to what they're reading because they're bored with almost everything they read, unless it's a magazine on skateboarding or something else that they like, and they're just not paying attention. In school, it's easier at home to manage children like this because parents have access to all kinds of reinforcers that you don't during the school day. And parents have a lot more flexibility in getting through 3 to 9 than you do. You have things you must accomplish with 20 or 30 children. Parents have 1, 2, 3, or 4 at home that they can kind of manipulate and negotiate around. Your challenge is that you can't be dropping $5 bills on their desk every 5 minutes to turn every assignment into an 8 or a 9 or a 10. And the older they get, the harder it is just to use your personality or your relationship with them. So I ask you, short of telling the parents that their children need to be on Ritalin, which usually is some moment of truth created by the school situation, when you can, to focus on mastery rather than amounts. To reduce workload when you can, especially in homework situations. And there are a few reasons for this. Number one, parents feel pressure from you to help get the work done. And they feel that they're not going to look like good parents if the kids are not doing their homework at night. At the same time, we've got third graders and fourth graders and fifth graders who have attention deficit syndrome or who are like this, who not only are doing homework, but they're doing a stack of classwork that was unfinished. And when the parents see these papers, they feel obligated to get this done for you. Those children are not only in school from 7:30 till 2:30, but they're in school from 4:30 till 9 trying to get all of that done. Their relationships with their parents now are built all around getting this stuff done, and nobody's having any fun at home. So when you hear this is happening, please let the parents off the hook and allow them to get through with the homework assignments as soon as the children prove that they've mastered the assignment. In other words, if they have to write spelling words in five sentences, let the parents work out an arrangement with the children so that after writing them 2 times, the parents give the child a spelling test. If they get 90 or above, they're finished. They don't have to do the other 3. Let's move on to math. Okay, here's 20 math problems. They're all division. You get 3 in a row correct, you're finished. Even if it's the first 3, that's right. If you get the first 3 correct, you're finished with that assignment. Now, what you've done is motivated the child to learn because you've turned learning into the key to get out of doing the tedious task. So this is why I'm saying if you focus in on attention span as the problem, you'll miss the core issue of it being stimulation. And if you realize that turning them on is the key to getting through every day, then your interventions will be oriented towards this issue rather than worrying about whether they're paying attention enough, whether you have to move them from the front of the room to the back of the room or move Johnny away from Mary because they're talking all of the time. What you need to do is create stimuli around what you want them to do. Please let the parents out of quantities and productivity whenever you can and just have them focus in on amounts. I miss the issue of girls, females, and I don't want to leave that because it's very important. Typically, and this is without judgment, this is not a sexist comment, but men and women are different from each other. The fact that there are Mars and Venus books all over the place and that the relationship section in bookstores is bigger than any other speaks to that as much as that we want equality as creatures, social, emotional, psychological creatures, there are differences between the sexes. Boys and men tend to be externalizers. They tend to be more physically expressive of what they feel. And women tend to be more internal. And this is why females are more prone to what we commonly call depression than men are. Why aren't men ever depressed? Why aren't they going to the therapist? Because they're acting it out by beating people up in bars, domestic violence, car accidents, playing softball, bowling, doing all of these kinds of things. And women are inside taking it personally, pounding themselves with the same feelings that men pound other people with, and it leads to the more classic depression. Well, how does this relate to attention deficit syndrome? When girls are bored, they tend to fantasize and mentally stimulate themselves through mental hyperactivity rather than physical hyperactivity. So the girls tend to be the ones that we call spacey, undermotivated. They're not causing trouble in the class, but they're not getting any more work done than the boys who are bouncing off the walls and won't sit down and are sharpening their pencils 100 times. So while the ratio of boys to girls being diagnosed in childhood is 5 to 1, I think it's probably very close to being even. But because we insist on seeing this hyperactivity, and if we don't see it, we think it's not ADD, we're missing all of these girls who have a temperament that's different from boys. They're not paying any more attention, but they're finding their 8s, 9s, and 10s in thinking about what they'd rather be doing than sitting in class. And you call their name and they don't respond. You call their name again and somebody next to them taps them on the shoulder, by the way, the teacher's talking to you. And they come out of that for a few minutes, they answer your question. They may even kind of heard everything you said, but they can't be there completely because it's below their stimulus threshold, and they start to buzz and vibrate with boredom when they're like that. Okay, quickly, medication. It's important to talk about this because it goes along with the concept of the problem being stimulation and not understimulation rather than overstimulation. Some years ago, the theory was that when children took stimulants like Ritalin, that they worked in reverse on children because it seemed to calm kids down, but if adults took them, it would wire them up and stimulate them. But what happens is that the Ritalin or Dexedrine or Adderall work just like the Rugrats work or just like a computer game or Super Nintendo work. In other words, if you have a very hyperactive 7-year-old and they love to play a computer game, you can get rid of that hyperactivity, the grumpiness, the irritability, the lack of compliance, the oppositional behavior by taking out that Super Nintendo. And for that hour, that child's mood, attitude, and behavior looks just like every other 7-year-old on the block. Because the Super Nintendo has activated the brain chemically and electrically so that they're able to regulate themselves. What happens with the medication is that it doesn't calm them down. What it does is stimulate their brains so the world doesn't have to be as interesting to turn them on. And they're more satisfied with low and mid-level stimuli. When they calm down, it's not because they're being drugged, and this is very important for you to tell parents because this is a thing that bothers parents more than anything else, that it's going to turn their kids into zombies. But what happens is that the children don't need to use hyperactivity anymore to counteract the boredom because they're not as bored. So their feet stop twitching, they stop asking to run errands for you, they stop talking as much, their personality seems to change, they're not the class clown anymore, not because their humor has changed, but because they're not using joking around anymore to stir things up in the classroom, to get you angry, so that they feel like there's something happening now. Because they turn that 5 classroom into a 9 by stirring up trouble. They take their medication, your lesson all of a sudden is reaching their stimulus threshold, they're hearing most of what you're saying, they're not vibrating with boredom, and the problem is solved not because they're being drugged down or sedated, but because they're being stimulated enough by the medication to appreciate the stimulation in the classroom. So really, when parents use the medication, the big worry and concern is not what it's going to do to the child in terms of side effects, because those are primarily a loss of appetite during the dosage of the medication, and some children feel a little anxious, but really the biggest concern is that it won't work. Because when it works, 60 to 70% of the time, as many of you probably know, the improvement is dramatic, not a little bit. And the biggest problem, speaking as a psychologist and not a medical doctor, is not overdosage, but it's underdosage. It's physicians who are too conservative with the medication and never give the children and families a chance to see whether it will work or not. The dosage does not seem to be based on size. It's based on severity of the condition. So while all children will start at a baby dose just to make sure that the side effects aren't worse in terms of stomach aches or headaches, a 5-year-old who's, let's say, an 8, 9, or a 10 on the scale of hyperactivity may need twice as much Ritalin as a 15-year-old who has attention deficits without hyperactivity and just needs it during the school day to listen in class. So if there's a very hyperactive 6-year-old who weighs 28 pounds and they're on twice as much as your teenage nephew, don't worry about that, because it all has to do with how much the child's brain needs to be stimulated to counteract the boredom that the child is trying to fend off through hyperactivity and impulsivity and so on. So usually the rule of thumb or the principle that I go by is this, that there are two things in childhood that you want to worry about. First is self-esteem. So that if you have a child who, no matter where they go in the community, they're being told, don't come here, don't stay here, go back home, we don't want to play with you. The second day on the bus in summer camp, they're thrown off because the bus driver can't manage them. You take them to camp, and 3 days later, the counselor has ejected them from the camp program. This all piles up on children's self-esteem, and in a very short period of time, they're going to feel defective, they're going to feel broken, they're going to hate themselves, and they're going to be angry children. Taking 10, 15, 20 milligrams of Ritalin a day and maybe having a headache once in a while or not wanting to eat lunch is a little thing compared to a child's self-esteem going down the tubes by 5, 6, or 7 years old. So always help parents put this in perspective. And let's not make an issue out of the word drug when the costs are really mild compared to the potential benefits. We do have children who don't have behavior problems in the community and at home, but don't begin to show problems until 4th or 5th grade with academics. And you have to sit down and ask the child and ask the family, can you live with the B's and C's as opposed to A's that you had a year ago? And some parents say yes. The more we can put off using the medication, the better, as long as they're learning what they need to learn. So what I want to know from you teachers is, I understand the grades have to do with not handing work in, but if you feel that they're not paying attention long enough to get the concepts and the skills, then I need you to let me know about that, because we'll need to do something. Other children can't live themselves with getting B's and C's, and they want the A's. And it may be time in 4th grade for that child to go on medication just for the school day. So the other principle is that the medication is needed to normalize the child's life during whatever arenas or periods of day that are not normal for that child. If the child loves baseball, which is not a great sport for many children with ADD because there's a lot of standing around, so soccer tends to be the best, followed by basketball if they're good, because then they'll be playing, because only 5 people play at a time with basketball. So what you want to do, if the child insists on playing a sport or an activity, they may need to take their medication before baseball practice, because they're stuck in right field, and they're standing around all the time, and they're throwing rocks out there, and the coach is getting angry at them. So it's used when needed. It doesn't have to be a horrible kind of thing. It's really a benefit. In fact, I have to say that of all of the neurological kinds of problems, we probably do not have anything that helps children more than the stimulants do for children with attention deficit syndrome. You know as teachers that we cannot get rid of learning disabilities. There's no medication that gets rid of dyslexia, spelling problems, math problems. Could you imagine how incredible it would be if we had a medication with as few side effects as Ritalin that would get rid of learning disabilities if they took it? In other words, if they took Ritalin, spelling disabilities and written expression disabilities went away. It would be an incredible thing, but it doesn't work on anything but attention deficit disorder like this. Okay, out of time? Thank you for your attention.